Bless you.
So as I went through this chapter, the word that came back to mind again and again for me was the word intersectionality. Does everyone know what that means? Intersectionality is that where our lives have connection between them, and which can be wonderful spaces of developing relationship or horrible spaces of making boundaries between us. Right? And as we looked at Indigenous and Black Americans, they had lots of spaces of intersectionality that were sometimes used wonderfully, where they found community together, but often used as ways of creating racial and racial hierarchies and economic hierarchies and ways of exploiting one against the other. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I want to start off by just asking the question, as you went through your life, where did you meet, in either positive or negative ways, spaces of intersectionality with people around you that were different? And it happens in all kinds of different ways. So don't limit yourself just to racial questions, but however it is that those boundaries between us showed up. So where is it that you face that?
Well, for me, growing up in Oklahoma, I went to school with a lot of Native people, and I was aware of the tribe around me.
And there is a lot of Native there, and if you're not aware of that, then you're really shortchanging the world for yourself. But I'm guessing, Tricia, and you can tell me if I'm right or not, that you had some Oklahomans that were happy to not move into that intersection with each other.
Yeah, there was certainly a lot of prejudice. And you know, it was mostly in the form of derogatory statements about Native people, you know, like Native people are like this, you know, and it was always, you know, the drunks. I mean, it was really mostly about alcohol. That was what I heard, and certainly I saw it too. I mean, it makes you grimace, you know, the drunks at the railroad tracks, for one thing. That was I don't know what the statistics are, but I know Native people get run over by trains on a regular basis. I don't know why they drink in that area of town, but that is not an unusual statement. So there was callousness, you know, like, oh, you know, another Indian fell on the railroad track. There was a real callousness of reporting a death like that. Yeah. Like we just expect that to happen. Oh yes, well, it was a Native person, so you know, of course.
And probably, if you're honest, a judgment as not just callousness, but a judgment about that callousness as well. Right?
Yeah, almost like they deserved it.
Yeah,
asked for it. They asked for it.
Absolutely not uncommon at all. Sorry, I just turned on the captions for us, so that you can read, just in case you can't understand, because you know Oklahoma accents don't always come. I'm just kidding, Trish. That was my Texan coming into intersectionality with your Oklahoman. Sorry.
I mean, on the other hand, I certainly did play with Native children, and sometimes I found those differences interesting. I mean, the powwows were lots of fun.
Yeah.
So you know, the dancing and so on. That was an event to go to. That so there was certainly some. You know, I definitely had those poor, pathetic people. That was definitely in my mind. Those poor people, those poor, pathetic people, which is very racist, really. And I recognize that now. But there was also like the colors that they wore, you know, the beauty of the native traditions and the dancing and the culture and the fry bread, right? The food that they would serve. So there was an appreciation for it as well. And where I grew up, everything under the sun is named with Indian names, right? So I was used to the language because streets and buildings and all sorts of things are native words.
Yeah, so, you telling that story reminded me of when I was 14, I came and spent a summer down here in Arizona. Up in the mountains, either in Springerville, and lived with my Aunt Betsy, who on Sunday morning took me to a little church in Zuni, New Mexico, which if you go up past Sanders, it's off that direction, just across the border into New Mexico. And I realized as I look back on it that it was kind of more of a, I gotta go help those poor Indians. And I don't think her heart was just that. I think she had a good heart, but as I go back to it, it was a bit mercenary like that, which is not untypical of what white America has often done. Right? That's often been our space there. How about the rest of you? What parts of intersectionality have you come across, both good or negative?
Well, I think about it a lot, being in social work. I, came across a lot, and the thing that comes to mind the most is I took a course at SDSU on working with Hispanic clients. And I expected that there would be a lot of white people in there learning how to work with Hispanic clients. And it wasn't, it was basically two of us who were Anglo, and then everybody else was Hispanic, which I found kind of fascinating, but there was a real difference in the way that they, I felt like that they were doing social work and the way that we were doing social work. And it was also very shocking. I think it was one of the first times I realized the tremendous sense of animosity towards Caucasian Americans, because it was directed at the two of us. And I just thought that was really interesting, that just blinders that I had on.
Right.
And then I also worked with teenagers in substance abuse, and that was just wonderful. That was an amazing experience, but very different kinds of backgrounds than I could even imagine growing up.
Yeah. We forget the real cultural difference between a 15-year-old and even a 25-year-old or a 38-year-old, right?
And I was 50, so.
Yeah. And there is huge differences. But your story about taking that class reminded me of my first year teaching Hispanic kids in Glendale. And one of my best learning experiences is when I realized that what I was doing, which was a very Anglo-typical thing to do, was really doing the opposite of what I wanted. Here's what it was. Let's say that you have a kid who is misbehaving.
Yeah.
Go and correct them, and you look at them, and if they look away, what's the Anglo thing to say to them?
Look at me.
Look at me when I'm talking to you. Hispanics are taught to look away as a sign of respect. And so to tell them to look at me is to say, be defiant to me as I'm correcting you. And so I was actually asking them to be the opposite of what I wanted them to be, because I didn't know their culture well. And so just learning that allowed me to step into an intersection very different than what I would have otherwise. But you have to be open to something like that, not just let's change them into my definition of, which is what we often do in the intersections, isn't it? Because it's simpler.
And we've been talking about, a lot about that lately, about, with my coming here to St. Francis. Because it is so different than what I'm used to, you know, and I'm constantly walking around going, Melissa is so much nicer than I am. You know, because of the way that St. Francis acts compared to other churches that I have been to.
Mhm.
And when I first started with the teenagers, I had this very authoritarian, you know, especially with the boys, you know, I won't take anything from you. And what I learned was that when I backed off and was softer, so to speak, I became their mother.
Yeah.
And I became a lot less threatening, and I also put myself in a much safer place.
Yeah.
So that I could walk into the middle of a fight and they're gonna stop,
Yeah.
because, you know, they
Mom's here
respect
now.
moms here, and
Yeah.
they have a tremendous respect for their mothers.
But the difficulty, of course, is that we literally have years of European conflict type of spaces where we say, where we know certain ways of being and acting,
Mhm.
that we assume are the right ways of being and acting in this particular case, and it may not have any positive definition in that space. But we bring that because that's what we know, and that's what we've been taught. I mean, what you described in some ways is exactly what the first Americans were doing, is they were saying, let's, as soon as you start acting like me, then,
Right,
right? Completely overlooking whatever value might have been in the life that was already there. And so we took on a paternalistic, I have the right answer, I'll nurture you into. Right? How many had never heard of the doctrine of discovery? Doctrine of discovery is the thing that, a long-standing belief that Christian nations had the right to rule over non-Christian nations.
Mhm.
That there's something superior about this way of being, and so I have not even just the right, but the responsibility to bring my order, the Christian order, into this space. And I believe even though we're not claiming that any longer, it's really easy for us to step in that role still and say, who do I have to help to learn the right way to do something? And in worst cases, who do I have to save in order for them to be in the right space? Right?
right.
But that's because we Anglos, and specifically we white, relatively prosperous male Anglos have privilege that we sometimes think that everyone else has, but that's just because we have a blindness to what, if I have it, then everyone must have it. And it's often not true.
And they must have it the way that I think that they want it.
That's right. They must want it exactly like me. That's exactly right. And talking across any kind of intersection between our lives takes some effort. And so we often just say, well, when you become like me and come over here to my, that's an easier way to do it, isn't it? It doesn't necessarily help at all.
I
Right?
don't have to work then to figure out what would be the best for both, or what would facilitate both of us. I can just do it my way, and I've already got that down.
Yeah, so you place all the work on the other person.
Right,
You have to learn my rules, you have to learn my way of speaking, you have to learn my way of living, and then we'll communicate well. So if you become white enough, male enough, rich enough, whatever it is that I'm using as my definition, then we can have a conversation. Before that, I get to be paternalistic and feel good about myself.
And it's interesting that you bring that up, because I had a friend whose mother was teaching at one of the Indian schools in Denny Hotso. And she had been in there visiting her mom, and at the same time, not to cast aspersions on your former faith base, but there were a group of missionaries from the LDS church there. And as she was walking by one of the classrooms, she heard this person say to a room full of Navajo children, and the better Mormons you become, the whiter you will get.
That is absolutely a belief that is through the Book of Mormon, having a fairer countenance is often the mark of how God works,
All righty then.
right? And so it's built within that theology way too much. That is not practiced as much as what it used to be, but it is absolutely there. And that's I hope an extreme version of what we all do,
Mhm.
but what we all have to fight against. Where is it that I'm expecting you to become white enough or whatever enough like me that I feel comfortable in being there? And the opposite is, where is it that I say I choose to enter into the intersection even though it's more challenging, and choose the relationship between us and try to see the value of where you're at. We're too much like the folks in here. I can't remember what exactly where it was, but talked about, is there, you know, they talked about how the Indians have such a sparse population in a large area, and is that a good use of that, or should we do it the Anglo way, essentially? You know, we have to make use of this environment better than what they do.
Mhm.
And I think that we do that in a lot of ways, right? Is a factory a better use of the world? Well, it certainly gets a lot done, but at a pretty big price. But we put a value on this factory rather than saying, well, maybe hand woven artisan things are better, even though they're not as efficient. But we don't take the time sometimes to be in that space of relationship to learn that.
Mhm.
So what do we do about all this? How do we step towards, what do we do to try to solve this? I think we have to have a value on other that isn't readily taught to us.
Hmm.
Okay, too often our values are formed by those segregation spaces and segregation mentality that kept us separate, and sometimes for good reason. Like in the Methodist Church, we've done a lot of dividing and coming back together, dividing and coming back together. But one of our longest term splits, we've never tried to heal. Do you know what it is?
The AME church.
The AME church and the other two colored churches that left at the same time, the Colored Methodist Church and Zion. Oh, I'm not remembering it. They left in the 1700s, right? 250 years ago, they left Methodism. No, they left the Methodist Church that's perpetuated as the largest body. So, and we've never tried to heal that. Now, frankly, I think they have good reasons to not want to be healed and brought back, because there would be a lot of be white like me that would happen there. And yet us not choosing to be in some kind of relationship with them. And if you go to an AME church, there's a whole lot of similarities between their Methodism and our Methodism, but we haven't tried to figure out that we are part of the same.
And that's the most fun I've ever had in church, was at an AME.
It is a fun place, right?
Yeah.
Why
But
did
that-
they,
But
was it the issue of slavery and abolitionism? Why did they split?
I think they looked and said, you don't want me in your churches. I
And
mean,
we don't want to be white like you.
we don't want to be white like you. I think that it came down to all of that. I don't want to be told by a white pastor how to behave, because that feels too much like the plantation owner telling me how to behave.
Mhm.
And so I think it was all of that type of dynamic. And so we're better off to have our own church. And frankly, I understand that, because I think that sometimes the reason why a Black person feels comfortable is because we've made them white enough for us that they're not foreign any longer.
Mm.
And is that the right thing we want to do? Is that truly honoring them, their heritage and who they are? Or do I need to take time going to an AME church and feeling what is the difference of the spirit there? What is the reasons for that difference? And be able to grow, have me grow into them, not the other way around.
Mhm.
Was watching on Facebook a meeting, and it opened with the Methodist. It was the Creek. It was the Creek Nation, and it opened with Methodist because they were huge missionaries into this community. Prayer and ceremony, and they were dressed indigenously, and I thought it was such a strange thing to see because of the Jesus piece in the salvation message in this Creek setting that was also talking about the earth, and it was just weird. It was like two things smushed together that, for me, looking on the outside, just did not seem to gel well.
Yeah. I felt the same way, going back to my growing up with some of the people that I've known that are Samoans or Fijians, that will be in a grass skirt and a white button-up shirt, like a good Mormon in a white button-up shirt, but then it just feels assimilated.
Not that,
in some way.
And I was listening to an African American talk one time, and probably Malcolm X or someone, talk about how can you actually completely liberate yourself from the white culture if you take on their white gods and their white religion, and they felt that you had to go back. I don't know if you have to go completely back, but I understood what they were saying, that how are you going to completely free yourself if you're taking on a religion that does not honor you and doesn't have your values and culture in mind.
Right. And the hard part about that is that, of course, I go and I get into a conversation with that person who has retreated, from my perspective, to something that's lesser than, and it's easy for me to continually devalue that person in the conversation instead of being in an honest conversation and say, what's the power of that God that you're drawing from? Not just placing that in some kind of progression towards my God, right?
Yeah.
It's not helpful, but it's easy for us to do.
Well, let me bring up, I grew up here in Tucson, right by the Social Security building, which used to be a lot we played in. And that neighborhood was of mixed economics. So we had a lawyer across the street, college professor down the street, blue collar workers. And I went to Amphi Junior High, which by then is completely different population than the Amphi Middle School where I taught for 18 years. So part of it, and then in the middle of the 60s, a lot of the richest people moved out to the foothills. And so now that area is all lower class. And it's probably poor would be a better word, with some exceptions. So part of it has been, we've lost the where bank presidents and ordinary people are in the same community. We've separated. And then of course, in that came the racial divide as well. And then I'll just bring up one of the things that concerns me right now is the movement towards an authoritarian Christianity in which and I'm going to use the word Almighty God, He is on top, and then the rich people, and then the middle class, and of course always the men first and the women are subordinate. Yeah. And that is being justified by scripture. So it frightens me because it's threatened to democracy, but it seems to turn Christianity upside down.
Right? And that is the scary part, isn't it? We've turned what works for me into the religion that should work for all of us. And it's not the religion that I think is preached in holy books, but it works for my psyche. So why isn't it completely true? But the reality is, it's because God isn't usually concerned about becoming what works for my psyche. God is hoping that I move towards what's right for God's psyche.
He's fluid.
Yeah, and but we continually get stuck in places like that. But do I mean, that's just one more example though of European Americans, Europeans coming over and saying, we have the singular right answer for, and so fit this model that we bring to you. And how arrogant of us to say that that's the correct model, and especially the only correct model, because it might have correctness to it, but it doesn't mean that we should have the biopic of saying, and you don't. And so in the chapter, it talked a lot about indigenous versus colored, and how they clash very often because Anglo pitted them against each other, right? And said, put this here so that there was the tension here rather than the tension between them and Anglo. It's much simpler and damaging in a lot of ways. I didn't show you guys a picture from last week that I meant to show you. Can I show it to you? When we're talking about fear. Let me share my screen. Oh, what happened to it? Oh, come on. I'm sorry, I'll find it. I must have closed it. I don't know why. But I'm sorry, I'll be right there. Really, I'm coming. Just wait for me. Hold on. Okay. I want you to look at this picture. I'm going to try not to talk much because I want you to see the bottom of the screen. Oh, you're not seeing it yet because I didn't share it. Sorry. Oh, yeah. I'm getting there.
We have faith in you.
Thank you. I need it. Same street corner. Two different protests. What do you see different from the top to the bottom?
Police.
Yeah.
A lot of police in the bottom picture, right? What else?
Well, scarcity.
A lot less people in the bottom picture, right? Top picture, white lives matter. Bottom picture, black lives matter. Within weeks of each other in 2020, summer of 2020.
Wow.
Is that an incredible shot?
Yeah.
Who should be that which is more fear invoking? I would think the larger crowd.
There are probably more guns in that crowd than there are in the Black Lives Matter crowd.
Right? And yet here's where the police presence is. Both cars and the line of police officers. No traffic flowing by, completely different than here. And so they've told a story, as we often do. Narratives often drive how we view things. Let me come back to so everyone can see each other. we often tell stories. Were you guys able to see everything there? Okay. We tell stories. Blacks are more violent. We have to have more police presence. Even though the size of the crowd and the amount of gun power that is there might not tell that story at all, but we've told a story about them. Do we believe, why do we continue to believe the narratives that are easy instead of finding a better way of doing something?
I think a lot of times with that, it's because for those of us who don't believe the narratives or are learning to not believe the narratives, we often feel that it's like, it's just me. And, you know, even though Dr. Seuss tells us that, you know, one person can change the world, we don't always feel that way. And I know talking with people who do have little teeny weeny tiny steel door closed minds, trying to get them to even open their eyes and accept that maybe I might be saying something worth thinking about, they're not going to think about it. And so often you feel like a salmon swimming upstream, and it makes it really, really difficult. It's nice when you find another person who feels that same way and is willing to hold hands with you as you know, continue that swim. And then hopefully you'll find some other people along the way. But right now, those of us who are willing to listen to a different story and work to change the narrative are smaller than the people that are screaming to maintain the status quo.
And sometimes we come by it honestly. Have I told you before about my nephew's wife, Christy? Did I tell you guys that story? Christy.
We told it in church, so.
Okay, all right. So Matthew is my nephew. She's my oldest nephew. They live in the Dallas area. She is, from my perspective, extremely prejudiced towards Hispanic Americans. And she has a reason why she is. Because a friend of hers was killed by a recent immigrant with a criminal record. And so she stretches that out to say everyone who crosses the border has that same kind of record. Everyone has that same kind of murderous intent. And she will hear nothing more than that, even though statistics belie that the incidence of murderous crime is higher in white Texans than what it is in Hispanic Texans, either immigrant or long-term. It's higher. It's just that statistically a fact. But she wants to believe her narrative because she wants to be angry at.
Yeah.
Right? In some ways it's simpler. And there's a whole lot of that's out there. That's a choosing not in that intersection space. It's choosing to find differences to separate instead of moving into the space of how are we the same? What are the concerns that are in this intersection that are the same as my concerns? Because she's the parent of 4 kids, and I'm guessing that most of the Hispanics she would come across also love and care for their children.
Mhm.
But could she get into that conversation of love and care for children, or does her fear of the criminality that she's placed on there always supersede that ability to see the intersection?
Mhm.
But it's,
I was gonna say, I don't mean to be a conspiracy theorist, but I also believe that we don't get a lot of help from our government because it's easier for them if we're all in fear of each other.
that's right.
And so there's no real movement to change the narrative because this narrative works really well for keeping us separate and scared of each other.
Sure, and that's historical too. We saw in this section places where the Black population and the indigenous population had times of realizing that strong intersectionality and being in partnership of different sorts with each other. We also saw places where it was much simpler to see separation. At least I'm still a separate nation. I have some sovereignty, even though it's all under the control of the Anglo population, the English. Because those blacks, I want to be like them because they have no sovereignty at all. And so I understand part of why people move that way, but ultimately it's accepting a lesser state instead of bringing yourself together to try to move towards a better state. So it's simpler, but at what cost?
There were two interesting parts in this chapter for me. One was the indigenous people who actually connected with, married into the black enslaved peoples, and they ran away together and they formed their own communities and were very happy. And then the government basically said, among the first acts taken up in the new state legislature in Senate Bill number 1 was the passage of Jim Crow laws that categorized Native Americans with white people and segregated black people based on a one-drop racial rule. So again, white America went, here, let's put some division in this thing that's working, you know, for these peoples, and make them hate each other again.
Yeah.
But why?
Because
I think that goes back to chapter 4.
that's right, because it keeps white America in power. Even if it drags the rest of the country into hell with them,
Mhm.
it keeps us in power. And is that good enough for us?
Is it good for
Is
us?
it good at all?
Not at all.
Right? And yet we continue to perpetuate that type of thing. We continue to have people around us perpetuate that. And so at some point or another, we've got to find a better way to address those types of issues. You know, there's at least some case that could be made for much of the backlash, much of the struggle that we're facing right now is the impending minority status of white America. The next 10 to 15 years, white America will be less than 50% of the total population. And that fear of loss of control, I think, is fear invoking. Go ahead, Ron.
So first of all, I want to put in a plug for adult ed. Next Sunday,
Good.
11 to 12 in room 50, we're going to be talking about safe communities and reframing the prison reform and police reform into taking a look at ways to make communities safe and getting away from the law and order. And I'd just like to bring up, I know it's a little challenging, but one thing that bothers me is the language. So often when what's happened throughout our history is that for instance, in the Trail of Tears, the poor whites were basically pitted against the Native Americans. And so we've made that battle throughout our history, and it's just switched parties back and forth.
Yeah.
And if we get away, because if somebody hears white power and white, they're going to say, I don't have that much power. I mean, they may be a step up above someone else, but there's no white community in the sense there's no black community. There's variation. So we can work away at looking at the power structure rather than identifying it as white, because even when the demographics change, all that the dividers have to do is make white a little bit larger. And that's the way it's happened. So we excluded the Irish and then we brought them in. We excluded the Germans and then we brought it in. So.
You know what's funny about that, Ron, is it struck me how much all of that you just described is saying, let's let's accept mediocrity as the best we can be. Instead of wanting to aspire to something better than that.
Well, I would agree that and in fact, it has, I mean, there have been the fusion parties. So during the initial part of Reconstruction, there was an alliance between poor blacks and poor whites.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, Jim Crow put an end to it.
Yeah.
And if right now, if you took a look at, if only white people voted, Lyndon Johnson would have been the last Democrat to win. And unfortunately, our parties have become more and more polarized by race.
Interesting.
And I don't know, I don't know, there's, well, I would always push something like Pima County Interfaith in ways that we can begin to work across the divide.
And somehow, if we don't figure out how to work across those divides, I think we're gonna end up with less than mediocre.
I think, I mean, and I've shared this with you before, I think we're heading for civil war if we do not somehow get a grip on the polarity that exists in our country.
Right?
And I think that those of us who are more on the left are going to be in for a really rude awakening in terms of how we're going to end up on that power struggle, for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think that'll be the moment if we do end up in a civil conflict of any kind, is where we'll find out that those of us who have always been leaning toward inclusion and unity and all this stuff are going to find ways to polarize, and then we'll win. So
Yeah. The hard part is, so Melissa, I gave you a thing that I got from the conference reconciling committee, and it was about use of pronouns, right? And oftentimes when that type of thing comes up, it says, well, why should I have to worry about that? I'm comfortable with my pronouns. Because it's not about me.
Right.
Right? It's about whoever it is who hasn't been able to be honored with the pronouns that they like. And me taking the time to move towards and honor that differentiation rather than say, be like me, because I'm comfortable. And that's harder work. It means we have to care about somebody who is not me. Go
And
ahead.
we have to get permission from the parents. Otherwise, we have to use their name, period, whatever the role says, that's it.
Yeah,
Doesn't matter if they say, call me,
yeah,
too bad.
yeah. And you know why that's in there? Because parents want it to be simpler for them,
Right.
rather than acknowledge that their kid might be dealing with something that is challenging. Right? That they want to have complete control of their child rather than let the child grow beyond just what the parent wants.
well, and it's interesting as we talk about pronouns. There's a conversation that if we ask a 5-year-old, are you a boy or a girl? And they say, I'm a girl, and that's their assigned gender at birth. We believe them and we trust their ability to say, I'm a girl. Why? Because it matches what they look like. But by the same token, if we ask that same child and they go, well, I'm a boy, well, then there's something wrong and we have to try to convince them that they're really a girl because they're only 4. What do they know?
Yeah.
Make up your mind.
Yeah, yeah.
Either they are able to identify themselves by how they see themselves at the age of 4, or they're not, no matter what they say.
But that again is stepping into that intersectionality place. Do I care enough? Do I have enough connection to them in some way or another? And it's not because I understand why this little girl looking person says they're a boy. It's because I care enough about something about them. I find some place where they are important to me and I think I'm important to them. And I sit in that space, and so I try to hear what they're saying. And that takes a different space than just let me tell you the right answer. That's not intersectionality, that's division making. Intersectionality is when you say, oh, tell me about it in some way or another.
And that's what it takes across everything, genders, colors, cultures, is if we don't care enough to listen, then we'll never grow from there.
That's
because
right.
We have to listen.
That's right.
If I know who you are and where you're coming from, it's easier for me to take your hand and we can walk different paths parallel to each other.
The hard part about that is that to do that you just described means that I can't just sit in a comfortable space. I have to move towards an uncomfortable place, or I have to put some effort into it. I have to choose that relationship, which might change me, might mold me differently, rather than just sitting in a space where I already am fixed the way I am.
Right.
And we see it's a white church. I mean, even in some of the liberal churches, we have a hard time, what's the word I'm looking for, taking the gender out of God.
That's right.
And we still refer as he and Lord, and, you know, there been times when you haven't been here and somebody else has stepped into your place that I've walked out and thought, dear God, if I hear he one more time,
Right.
I'm going to strip a gear.
Yeah. And it doesn't even have to be in some of those issues like that. Sometimes it's just, but we've always sung this song this way.
I've
Right?
always read the scripture.
We've always
like
read the
this.
scripture in a certain way. And so it's all kinds of things where we get stuck in a certain way. And unless we hear somebody else unless we choose to listen to someone who said, well, what if we said, what if we sang, what if we did? And that's stepping towards each other. Did someone over here want to talk? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, because I knew that somebody over there was brilliant.
I was just wondering if it's ever possible to be enough like me. I mean, I saw that illustrated in the chapter
Yeah.
where even those Native Americans who adopted white lifestyles and kept slaves and stuff, and you see it all the way through history, where it doesn't do them any good in the end. When the white people would come in, what they wanted, they took. And you even see it now. Will I ever be enough like you, kind of thing? And I don't mean like you, Jim. I mean like the white elite or something like that, you know. I don't know. I always have to wonder about that, if it's even possible. Because you can see a lot of how we've come in, even from the conquistadors and everything, come in and try to change everybody, make them do our religion, dress like us, live like us. But in the end, what does it do? Does it really do them any good?
The hard part, Melissa, is that whether we admit it or not, all of us are products of a white Northern European, because even Italians and Spaniards aren't quite given the same space. White Northern European model of how to do things, which is very oppositional, who's right and who's wrong, who has the strongest castle around them. And all of that molds us even as we try to reject it. And it's one that's very much built on profit centers, right? Getting more money and getting more power is better than being at a natural space with the world around you. But profit-based things are rarely as sustainable, right? Rarely, it's usually much more damaging to the world around. And other people are trying to teach us different than that, but we've heard that so much, it's hard for us not to stay in that space. We have to very purposely think about it, and it sometimes feels like, but you're asking me to give up something, lose something. You're asking me to not be the most profitable I can. Well, maybe I'm asking you to define profit differently,
Yeah.
right?
Well, we've already asked them not even to be what they were to begin with.
right? Right?
And we ask that all the time, even now, in
Yeah,
this world.
yeah, but we ask that very often at our comfort, okay, continue to let me have my profit, but you have to change in order to help me do that. Right? Go ahead.
We're none of us are pure white or pure anything.
Yeah, but we
Yes,
like to act.
we have Italian, we have German, we have many different things.
Yeah, but we like to act like somehow my blood is pure and yours is not. My blood is right and yours is deficient in some way or another.
I was sharing with Seth, when we were reading this chapter, I've shared before that I come from a very racist family. And our, the indigenous side, the Creek side was always very African American. I could never, as a kid, understand it. You know, you would think color with color, we would have gotten along. And I told Seth, I go, I think it would just be hilarious if we found out that my dad and my grandmother actually have a lot of Black in them because of all the intermarrying that went on that we didn't want to talk about.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because the Cherokees enslaved the largest number of people, but Creeks, Choctaws, and Chickasaws also developed entrenched systems of Black enslavement. So you know what was going on there. So basically, Doug was Black.
But we all love the hierarchies, which is very, very very European model to have hierarchies. Much of the other models are more family. But the problem is that Europeans, because they did hierarchies, they knew how to exploit the other. Both native and African were tribal spaces, and they said, Europeans came in and said, hey, go attack that other tribe, bring me some slaves from that other tribe. It's not you, but you'll be stronger both by what I give you for those and by the damage you've given to that. And they did the same thing here in ways that made it so that they maintained power and economic power as well as military power at the expense of.
Yeah.
And that's why I love like the movie Woman King. Have you gone and seen that yet?
The Warrior King, the
Woman King
Woman King.
with Viola Davis.
Oh, yeah, great movie.
And it's where she's beginning to say, if we keep being the way we've been, all we're doing is feeding the slave making European machine rather than helping us become something better. And how do we change that dynamic? And today I think we have that same type of thing. What is it that's continuing to feed a certain kind of power? And how do we stop playing that game? And move into.
I'm sorry. Maybe it's like what Seth was pointing out, is that it's kind of like you want to ally yourself with the strongest, you know, because that's going to, you think, is going to make it work better for you. It's going to go better for you, but sometimes it doesn't seem like it always does.
And at least part of what the spiritual message has always been, and it doesn't matter which spiritual message you're talking about, it's saying you have to be countercultural. You can't just do what it is that is simplest, easiest, gives you the most power. It's, if you want to be in the best spiritual space, then you have to think differently than that. It's relational, or it is not about who has the most power, but who has something different than that.
And I think that all rolls back to, I don't even remember which chapter it was when they were talking about the white plant, it must have been sugar. The white plantation owners were so scared of Black uprising, and the Blacks did not have enough cohesiveness to realize that you outnumber these white people, and if you all join hands and run, you know, you're gonna run right over them and pound them into the ground. Now, granted, the white people had guns, the enslaved peoples did not. However, they had enough numbers that if they really had had a Malcolm X back then,
But, well, what might have happened?
yeah, well, we wouldn't be in charge.
Yeah, yeah. But all of that takes a very different thought pattern, and I think that's what this intersectionality is about. It talks about how all through history, Black and Indigenous could have linked arms. And right at the end of the chapter, it gave that image,
Yes,
right? And wasn't that a great image? You know, I have a kind of picture of it. I couldn't find exactly what it was, but look at what it kind of looks like. Maybe. Maybe not. Wait, let me see. Oh no, that's not gonna let me do it.
That's on it.
I gotta go back over here again. Oh, here it is. Let me. So that's the type of thing that it's calling us into. Can we somehow, instead of having the animosity that has often been present between groups, step into a space where Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty can work together, can be part of the same beating heart, can find that power there, and can Anglo not want to be slave owner mentality also join in that and be part of this new way of being, new way of acting, this new way of coming together. Can we help learn a new way of interacting in America? Well, not unless we move towards the intersectionality. If we stay in the me against you, you against them against me, we continue to get what we got.
No, it will take a lot of work on the part of,
everyone.
well, everyone, but also Caucasian, because we're not trusted. You know, if you like go to a public demonstration like this and you're the few white people that are out there, they look at you askew, like, what are you doing here? And as you read through history, you kind of get it. The government did not honor a single commitment that they made to the
Right.
Indigenous people.
Right.
And so they look at us and go, we can't trust you.
Yeah.
And I can see why.
Right.
You know, it also reminds me of some of the movements in history, like the workers' movement. Until the workers got past, because when you have like coal miners or whatever, where you have the small percentage of people that are getting all the money, and then you have these people who are just worked to death. And they're not slaves, but in a way they are. They're indentured servants of some sort with the company stores and so on. But one of the things that they had to do is they had to get past their differences, whether they were Native or Black or white or you know what, Asian, you know, whatever their background, and maybe some of them had higher education than others. The workers had to unite as workers, that we are one, we are workers. And until they could get to that point, they really had no power. And the powers that be were trying to separate them, right? They were trying to keep, no, you know, the white, we'll give the white workers a little bit extra, the female workers don't get as much, and you know, whatever, they were trying to keep them separate. But until they could get past those differences and start seeing themselves as one, which is I think what we're talking about here, because you can make those judgments all day long and categorize those categorizations
Yeah.
of people. As long as you keep categorizing, then you're weak. It's when you stop categorizing and seeing you as a unified group that real change is possible, it seems like to me.
But that unity, we have to be really, thank you, Trish, because that's exactly what we have to move towards, but we have to make sure that unity is not everyone become like Jim.
Mm.
Because that's often what we try to turn unity into. And it really is that we are a multiplicity of different stars that become one universe, not all of us become just one big star. If that makes sense, which is what we often try to turn it into as a singularity, and it really is the multiplicity of all of us being more magnificent. And to do that, I have to move towards you and understand what it is in the weirdness and the differences of who you are, what makes you magnificent that's not like me.
Who you calling weird?
I thought everyone else but you.
Okay.
You know, that weirdness is uncomfortable for us as we move towards each other. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, it's just different. And we have to learn why it's wonderfully different. That you living on 200 acres and not using it in a way that would be economically profitable for me might be an amazing thing.
We're not allowed to have these kind of discussions with kids.
I know that's the hard part, but we should be having those discussions, because what those discussions are is how do we make our best future? I mean, companies should be having those discussions. What's the best way to make a company? You know, churches should be having those discussions. What's the best way for us to be the best, the best church we can be? And I gotta tell you, having pastored for the last 9 years, a church that is really broad and weird, right? It has a lot of diversity. It's a daunting task because people are going in a lot of different directions, but marvelous, wondrous directions if we truly do that. The more I try to control it and make it all go in one direction, the less I think I have the best sense of what St. Francis is.
Yes,
Probably
Francis is
rebellious.
weird.
Yeah.
Well, it's like the water and you're throwing a pebble in the way it goes,
That's right.
the pebble
And
lines.
that means I have to trust that water to go, those people to go. And that I think is what we're struggling with. And so we make laws that say, don't talk about that. When we really should be, that should be the discussion we should be encouraging.
And I had a discussion with John, who came in with the other Beth tonight. And they saw the book sitting on the table, and he and I started a conversation. And part of the thing that we're seeing in the United States right now, and the reason that this caused such a stir, is because this is education. This is not something that I learned in school.
No.
Some of it I learned because of places that I live, but I didn't know all of it. And we have a division in the hierarchy of our government, the people who don't want us to get any education at all, and the ones that would like us to have an education. Because the folks over here that don't want us to know anything, because if we don't know anything, we're easier to control. But if we start learning stuff, y'all are in trouble.
Yeah. Well, the good news is that we've almost solved all of this,
Almost.
right? We're almost there. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your care of this subject and the strides you're making to try to at least cross some of those challenging lines of intersectionality. Keep doing that.
And I invite you all to come on Sunday.
Go on Sunday and that'll be a part of that conversation. Next week, we are doing
Capitalism. I believe.
capitalism, because money doesn't drive hardly anything in America. So that should be some conversation.
Yeah, capitalism.
Hi.
My friends, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.